In a stunning turn, a federal appeals court has declared some of former President Trump's sweeping 2025 tariffs illegal, shaking Washington and global markets. The ruling questions whether a president can use emergency declarations to unilaterally impose tariffs, a power traditionally reserved for Congress. This is more than a legal technicality. It's a pivotal moment that could reshape American trade policy for years. The decision ignites a political firestorm, with the administration vowing to fight all the way to the Supreme Court. As the legal battle unfolds, the stakes are simple for Americans. Will everyday goods become more affordable, or will high tariffs persist? To grasp the court's decision, let's look at the tariffs in question. These tariffs were not just any ordinary trade measures, they were sweeping and unprecedented in their scope and impact. In early 2025, Trump imposed broad trafficking tariffs on imports from China, Canada, and Mexico, citing national security and emergency powers. This move was part of a larger strategy to address what the administration saw as unfair trade practices and to protect American industries from foreign competition. Soon after, he introduced reciprocal tariffs, a 10% baseline on most imports, with up to 50% on goods from countries with large trade surpluses. The idea was to create a level playing field and to encourage other countries to lower their tariffs on American goods. The legal basis was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, a law meant for extraordinary threats, not routine trade disputes. This act gave the president broad powers to regulate commerce in response to unusual and extraordinary threats to the United States. The administration argued that trade deficits and trafficking justified emergency action, bypassing Congress. They claimed that these economic imbalances posed a significant threat to national security and required immediate and decisive action. These tariffs marked a radical shift from decades of lower trade barriers, impacting nearly every sector of the economy. From manufacturing to retail, the effects were felt across the board, leading to higher prices for consumers and disruptions in supply chains. But this sweeping use of IEEPA drew intense legal scrutiny, setting the stage for the current crisis. Legal experts and trade analysts questioned the validity of using emergency powers for what they saw as routine economic issues. Now the very foundation of these tariffs is on the verge of collapse. The courts are now tasked with determining whether the use of IEEPA in this context was lawful, and the outcome could have far-reaching implications for U.S. trade policy and executive power. At the heart of this pivotal case lies a fundamental question about the balance of power in the United States government, a question that has shaped American democracy since its founding. Can the president, acting alone and invoking emergency powers, impose tariffs on foreign goods? Or is this a responsibility that the Constitution reserves exclusively for Congress, the legislative branch? This case tests the boundaries between executive action and legislative authority, raising the issue of whether the president can bypass Congress in matters of economic policy. The Constitution is clear. Congress holds the power to tax imports and regulate trade with foreign nations. These powers are not just technicalities, they are core elements of the legislative branch's authority, designed to ensure that no single branch can dominate economic decisions. In this case, President Trump's legal team argued that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, gave him broad authority to act during national emergencies, including the power to impose tariffs as a tool of foreign policy or economic leverage. However, the Federal Appeals Court carefully examined the language of IEEPA and found that it did not explicitly grant the president the power to levy tariffs. The court emphasized that such a significant economic power must be clearly delegated by Congress, not assumed by the executive. The judges ruled that while the president may regulate commerce in emergencies, regulating is not the same as taxing. The authority to create or raise tariffs remains a legislative function, and Congress must speak clearly if it wishes to transfer that power. This decision draws a firm and unmistakable line. Only Congress can create new tariffs or alter existing ones. The president, even in times of crisis, cannot act unilaterally to change the nation's trade policy. By reaffirming Congress's central role in economic policy, the ruling serves as a vital check on executive overreach and preserves the careful balance of powers that underpins the American system of government. Ultimately, this legal battle is about more than tariffs. It's about the separation of powers. a foundational principle that ensures no branch of government can act without oversight or accountability. The legal fight began months ago in the U.S. Court of International Trade, where businesses argued the tariffs were unlawful. The court sided with them, ruling Trump's use of IEEPA for tariffs was illegal. The administration appealed, but the Federal Circuit upheld the decision in a decisive 7-4 vote. Recognizing the stakes, the appeals court issued a temporary stay, keeping the tariffs in place until October 14, 2025. This gives the administration time to appeal to the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court takes the case, it sets up a historic showdown over presidential power. If not, the tariffs will be struck down for good. Not all Trump-era tariffs are at risk. Only those imposed under IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This law gives the president broad authority to restrict trade in the name of national security, but it's also the very foundation being challenged in court. The Supreme Court is now being asked to decide whether the president's use of IEEPA to impose certain tariffs overstepped legal boundaries, putting only a specific set of tariffs in jeopardy. The court's ruling zeroes in on the 2025 trafficking and reciprocal tariffs, measures that were justified using IEEPA powers. Older tariffs, like those on steel, aluminum, or a wide range of Chinese goods, were enacted under different laws, such as Section 301 or Section 232, and are not directly affected by this legal challenge. This means the vast majority of tariffs from previous years will remain untouched, regardless of the court's decision. If the Supreme Court upholds the lower court's decision, the 2025 tariffs imposed under IEEPA would vanish overnight. However, all other tariffs, those not tied to IEEPA, would continue to be enforced as usual. This selective removal could have ripple effects across industries and global supply chains. The result? A confusing patchwork of trade rules. Some products could see tariffs drop dramatically, while others remain subject to high duties. Importers and exporters will need to carefully track which goods are affected as the tariff landscape becomes more fragmented and unpredictable. For example, a toy imported from China might lose the 10% reciprocal tariff that was imposed under IEEPA, but it could still face a hefty 25% tariff under Section 301, which targets unfair trade practices. This means the total cost of importing that toy could drop slightly, but not disappear entirely. The ruling is a precise strike against IEEPA-based tariffs, not a blanket rejection of all presidential trade actions. It's a nuanced decision that leaves much of the existing tariff structure intact, while carving out a specific exception for those tariffs rooted in emergency economic powers. For businesses, this means navigating an even more complex landscape. Companies will need to reassess their supply chains, update compliance strategies, and possibly renegotiate contracts, all while keeping a close eye on which tariffs are in flux and which remain firmly in place. Ultimately, the Supreme Court's decision will reshape the tariff map, determining which trade barriers survive, which disappear, and how American businesses adapt to a new era of global commerce. Trump's response was immediate and fierce, blasting the court as partisan and vowing to fight to the Supreme Court. He warned that overturning the tariffs would flood the U.S. with cheap imports and harm American manufacturing. The administration's legal team is preparing a Supreme Court appeal, arguing that IEEPA grants the president broad emergency powers, including tariffs. They'll claim the ruling undermines the president's ability to protect national interests. The strategy framed this as a battle for executive authority in a dangerous world. The next step is clear: petition the Supreme Court before the October deadline. The stage is set for a dramatic legal clash over the limits of presidential power. The economic stakes are massive. Over $140 billion in tariffs collected since early 2025. If the tariffs are ruled illegal, the government could owe huge refunds to importers, creating financial chaos. For businesses, refunds could mean lower prices, more investment, and new jobs. For consumers, tariffs have driven up prices on everything from electronics to furniture. If struck down, prices could gradually fall as import costs drop. The uncertainty itself is damaging. Businesses can't plan, hire, or invest with tariffs in limbo. The legal battle is already sending shockwaves through the economy. The outcome will hit every American's wallet. The clock is ticking. October 14th is the deadline for the administration to appeal to the Supreme Court. If they file, the justices will decide whether to hear the case, likely keeping tariffs in place during review. If the court declines or the administration misses the deadline, the tariffs end immediately. If the court takes the case, arguments could stretch into 2026, prolonging uncertainty for businesses and markets. Billions in refunds and the future of U.S. trade policy hang in the balance. The countdown is a high-stakes waiting game for the entire economy. The Supreme Court's decision will shape the next era of American trade. All eyes are on Washington as the deadline approaches. This isn't just about tariffs. It's about the balance of power in American government. The case tests whether presidents can use emergency laws to bypass Congress on major economic decisions. If the courts block Trump's tariffs, it reasserts Congress's authority and limits executive overreach. If not, future presidents could wield emergency powers to reshape trade, and more, without legislative approval. The outcome will affect prices, jobs, and America's role in the global economy. It's a defining moment for the rule of law and the separation of powers. The final decision will echo for generations, shaping how America governs itself. This is about more than trade. It's about the future of American democracy.